G'day, this is Joseph Drew from the Institute of Public Policy and Governance, just introducing the topic of intergovernmental grants, which is the topic for week 4. So intergovernmental grants are exactly what is suggested by the title. It's a transfer of funds from one level of government to another level of government. In Australia, the system of intergovernmental grants that affects local government the most is called the Financial Assistance Grants, often abbreviated to FAGs. It's governed by the Financial Assistance Grants Act, which is a piece of Commonwealth legislation dated 1995. Because of presumed constitutional constraints, the federal government does not pass the money directly to the local governments. The money goes to each state, it's divided on the basis of population, and then each state government has a Local Governments Grants Commission which allocates the funds directly to the local governments. Now, because of this little constitutional complication, every local government jurisdiction is doing something completely and absolutely different. So whilst there's one piece of legislation at the Commonwealth level, whilst the money comes from the Commonwealth government, what we end up with is different local governments and different jurisdictions receiving very different allocations based on very different formula because the money's been passed through the state governments. Now, why do you have grants? Well, all federations do have grants. It's a common aspect, common condition of every federation. They bind the federation together. You know, in all federations there's always talk of possible secession. We had talk of Western Australia a few years back, as a matter of fact, in Australia. They stop wasteful lobbying. Otherwise you would have local governments or states lobbying for money off the Commonwealth. Much better to have a formula-based grant scheme where it's much more predictable and people aren't wasting effort trying to chase money. It stops pork barrelling. That's the practice of politicians giving money to specific areas or specific interest groups in order to buy votes, essentially. In Japan, interestingly enough, they call pork barrelling park barrelling, and from what I've observed in Australia over many years, park barrelling is probably a very good term. Often jurisdictions will be favoured with aquatic parks or equine parks or some other sports stadiums like in Sydney, and it's purely an exercise in political capitalisation, which is the exercise of turning capital, hard cash, into votes. So grant systems avoid all these things. Grant systems are good because they're based on formula, they're predictable, they're a lot more transparent than levels of government simply going with their begging bowl to higher tiers of government for money. All federations will have a system of grants, as I said before. That's because of a thing called a vertical fiscal imbalance, VFI. Very important term to know. Essentially, in every federation, what you find is the top tier of government, our Commonwealth government, collects most of the revenue, but has the least responsibilities. And when you think about Australia, most of the revenue comes through income tax revenue and corporate tax revenue. That's something the federal government collects. Most of the responsibilities actually lie with our state governments, not our local governments, unlike many other countries where local government does a lot more. So you think about the main things you receive from government: health, police, fire, education, all state government responsibilities. Local government in Australia, as I say, very limited remit. In many countries, local government does welfare. In Japan, local government does welfare, education, health, all the things that our state governments do. Here in Australia, it's not roads, rates and rubbish anymore, which is how it used to be characterised, but it's certainly a very limited remit compared to other countries. So this vertical fiscal imbalance will always exist in federations. Your top tier government gets most of the taxation revenue but has the least responsibilities. So you need a grant system, a system to transfer some funds from the top tier to the lower tier. Otherwise the lower tiers simply wouldn't be able to afford to fulfil their responsibilities. But there's another reason you always have grant systems in federations, but also in unitary states like Japan. They have HFE grants. And this is what I've just accidentally said, HFE, horizontal fiscal equalization. Different areas will have different levels of wealth. They'll have different levels of economic activity. And if you're in a country that believes that the outcomes people get in life should be determined by the effort they put in to work and study and things like this, rather than simply their postcode, if you're in a country like that, like Australia, well then you need a system of horizontal fiscal equalisation, because some local governments are simply in wealthier areas. They will always have higher fiscal capacity to be able to provide goods. Compare North Sydney or Central Sydney, the wealth and the taxation they can accrue because they're high property values and high incomes to individuals in those areas. Compare that to a place like the former local government area of Guyra, where there were very low incomes, very low property values, but very high needs. And this is what we often see in Australia, which makes the HFE even worse than what you'll see internationally, is that the poorer the area, the greater the needs. So your particularly less affluent areas in rural and remote Australia, they're also the areas where most of the road network are. So they've got huge needs. If you don't have a system of HFE, councils in those poor areas simply won't be able to provide basic services. And that's a problem, and that's certainly worthwhile having intergovernmental grants to address that. But also, if you don't have a system of HFE, companies and people will start shopping around for better local government areas. If you couldn't get basic services in rural areas, but you could get exceptionally high quality services in some urban areas such as North Sydney, companies are going to migrate to North Sydney, not because there's a better labour market there, or they're closer to their customer, or they're closer to the ports where they export the goods from, but simply because they'll get a better deal from government. They'll get better government goods and services. And that leads to what we refer to as inefficient migration of capital and labour, which is a very big problem for national economies. So these intergovernmental grant systems, we now know the money comes from the federal government through the state governments and gets to the local governments. They're there to address vertical fiscal imbalance, and they're there to address horizontal fiscal equity. It's about 7% of revenue for local governments in Australia is these FAGS grants. There are other grants, special purpose grants that you can get from the state government for particular projects. But on the whole, the FAGS grants are the main transfers in Australia. But that 7% is really a very conflated figure. In some areas, some very affluent areas, some rich councils, it might only be 3-4% of revenue. In some rural or remote areas, the FAG grants could be 30-40% of revenue. That's not a bad thing, contrary to what you would think by looking at the T Corp Fit for the Future ratios. It's just the facts of the matter. If you're going to allow local governments in relatively poor areas or relatively remote areas to provide basic services, if you're going to have a federation where most of the taxing powers reside in the federal government, you're going to have large grants. It's just the facts of living in a federation. So we've addressed the main issues and the reasons for grants. Now, are they effective? Well, no, they're not in Australia. There's simply not enough money on offer. That's one problem. The other problem is the way they allocate it. The Commonwealth legislation actually stipulates that every council must receive a FAG allocation, a FAG grant allocation, and that allocation must be at least 30% of what they would have got if it was allocated on the basis of population alone. Now, of course, as you've all immediately realised, most of your affluent local governments with less need are also very highly populated local governments, so they're going to get big grants that they may not necessarily need as much as some of these depopulated areas with huge road networks. One of your earlier readings looked at the autopsy of municipal failure, the case of Central Darling Shire, and the grants played a very big part in the downfall of Central Darling Shire. And it is a big issue that this country needs to address if we're going to avoid having particularly rural or remote councils, more of them go financially insolvent. That has huge effects on local communities, has huge effects on our national economy, because most of Australia's income comes from the rural areas through mining and agriculture. So the grants are incredibly important. We are doing a very bad job of it. It should be formula based. It should be a consistent approach through the whole country. If you're going to achieve HFE, it has to be. And if you're going to achieve HFE, you cannot have minimum allocations based on population size, because if everyone gets a grant, how are the lower capacity councils ever going to catch up to the high capacity councils? It's just mathematically, logically impossible. It's an impossibility. We could fix the system. I've been writing about it for a number of years. Brian Dollar has been writing for it for many years. There's a methodology out there. Countries like Japan, where I do a lot of work, I'm an adjunct professor at TMU, as you know, they do have very good formula-based grant transfer systems. We could have very good formula-based transfer systems in Australia too, but unfortunately it seems that we either don't have the people with the required skills in our local government grants commissions in each state and the Northern Territory, or those people aren't able to convince everyone that this is the way we need to go. So our system is rather chaotic. It's not achieving what the legislation hopes to achieve. They're lofty goals, HFE. It's a very lofty goal to think that anyone in Australia could have the same potential access to services no matter where they live. But it's a goal that we will never achieve under our current arrangements. Well, I'll trust that you'll really enjoy the readings. Grants have been in the news a lot lately, more so at the state level, things like value capture and the GST bun fight that we have every few years about GST distributions. You'll hear those terms: horizontal fiscal equalisation, vertical fiscal imbalance. These readings are designed to ensure that you understand the terms. I put the legislation as part of your required readings. Obviously you're not going to read it all. It's a very lengthy document, but please look particularly at section 6. It gives you an idea. It's plain English legislation. It's quite easy to understand. It gives you an idea of how lofty the goals are. Those early sections define HFE, for instance, and those of you familiar with how FAGs actually end up happening in practice, you'll see how far practice is from the legislated goal. You've got the chapter, section 7.2.3 from the Grant and Drew book, which talks about this in great detail. You've got the paper by Wallace Oates. Wallace Oates was the king of fiscal federalism in America. He's unfortunately deceased a few years ago. This paper you have is the seminal paper in fiscal federalism scholarship. You need to read this paper very carefully. It may take you a couple of reads to understand it, and please, if you have questions, please contact me. And there's a paper by Drew and Dollery on the inconsistency in these FAGs, with particular reference to the road grant component of financial assistance grants. I do hope you enjoy the readings. Please make sure that you go through the questions, and next Friday I'll send you the answers for them.